Amos chapter 1 this morning. This evening. That's a habit. Amos chapter 1 this evening, and we're going to continue through our study of the book of Amos. And the book of Amos is the story of a preacher. As you're turning there, let me tell you this story that I heard about a preacher going to safari on the Serengeti in Africa, and he's out and at the African Serengeti, and he's out there and he's in his little canvas tent, and while he's out there sleeping in the middle of the night, he hears this blood-curdling lion's roar that was so loud it shook his tent, and it sounded like that lion was right outside of his tent. Nothing between him and the lion but a thin layer of canvas. And needless to say, he did not get much sleep that night. And he tossed and turned all night and was scared the whole night. And the next day he came out of his tent and he went to one of the locals and said, "Man, did you hear that lion roar last night? It was so loud it shook my tent. It was right outside my tent." And the local began to laugh and said, No. That lion wasn't outside your tent. That lion was very, very far away. But you see, the thing is, at night in the Serengeti, the air just gets so thin at night that lion's roar just travels over a great distance, and it can sound like the lion is right outside your tent. Just imagine what it was sounded like if the lion really actually would have been there. You see, because when the lion roars in the jungle stops. Jungle comes to a complete stop. Why? Because the king has something to say. Now, as a sheep herder in southern Judah, Amos would have had to deal with lions, okay? But now he's dealing with a different type of lion. Now he's dealing with the lion of the tribe of Judah. And the first words out of Amos the preacher's mouth were these in verse number 2. And he said, "The Lord will roar from Zion and utter his voice from Jerusalem, and the habitations of the shepherds shall mourn, and the top of Carmel shall wither." You know, it only took one sentence for Amos to get his point across. You see, Bethel was the main religious capital of the northern kingdom of Israel, but there was another religious capital, and it was the city of Dan. So you had Bethel and you had Dan that were the major religious cities of the northern kingdom of Israel. And what Amos is telling them, he's telling them that their human religion that they had created at Bethel and Dan did not involve Jehovah God at all. The voice of God did not come from their houses of worship because the stamp of approval was still on the house of David in Jerusalem. So Amos begins his preaching. And as we open up this book and begin going through these verses, what Amos is going to do, he's going to start out by preaching 7 messages of judgment against the 7 surrounding nations that surround Israel. And, you know, it's not very hard to imagine that as Amos starts preaching against the enemies of Israel, that a crowd starts to gather. You want to know why? People love it when you preach on their enemies. People absolutely love it. What you find in churches today is that there are sins that are popular to preach against, and there are sins that are not so popular to preach against. Man, when we start talking about the national sins of America and all the wickedness that's going on out there, man, you get a lot of amens. Then as 1 Peter 4:17 says, "For the time has come that judgment must begin at the house of God." So when the preaching shifts from out there to in here, in a lot of churches today, the amens would stop. And Amos is ultimately going to point out to Israel that the problem isn't out there, the problem is right here. And what you're going to notice as we go through these verses is you're going to notice this, that he repeatedly uses this phrase, for 3 transgressions and for 4, I will not turn away the punishment thereof. And this became the outline of the indictments against these wicked pagan nations. And this is a very pointed way of preaching that these people have broken God's laws so much that they have exhausted the mercy of God. And basically, Amos is saying, you've sinned, and you've sinned, and you sinned, and now this 4th sin, this is the sin that triggers the wrath of an almighty God. And it's a powerful way of saying that the sins of the nations are multiplied before the God of the Bible, and the effects of those sins will not be overlooked. All of these many sins have led to this final sin. Now, Amos didn't list all the sins leading up to this point, but he says each of the 7 surrounding nations of Israel have gone so far that God could not turn away his punishment. And let me tell you something today. It takes a lot for human beings to exhaust the mercy of the one whose mercy is great unto heaven. Psalm 57:10, for thy mercy is great unto the heavens, and thy truth unto the clouds. It takes a lot for human beings to do that. So from Amos chapter 1 verse 3 to Amos chapter 2 verse 5, the preacher exposes one major sin of the surrounding nations around Israel that have triggered the judgment of God. And what you notice here, if you look at these nations on a map, is God is going through each point of the compass. That's what he's doing. You start with Damascus, Syria to the northeast, and Gaza to the southwest, Tyre to the northwest, Edom to the southeast, Ammon to the east, Moab to the southeast, Judah to the south, and just all the surrounding points of the compass God is preaching about. And what he's saying is no one is going to escape the wrath of God. Now, Amos started preaching against the cruelty of Damascus. These are people who are bitter enemies to the people of Israel that he's preaching to. So let's look at Amos chapter 1, verses 3 through 5. Thus saith the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Damascus and for 4, I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because they have threshed Gilead with threshing instruments of iron. But I will send a fire into the house of Hazael, which shall devour the places of Ben-Hadad. I will break also the bar of Damascus, and cut off the inhabitant from the plain of Avon, and him that holdeth the scepter from the house of Eden. And the people of Syria shall go into captivity under Kir, saith the Lord. Now, the great-grandparents of the people that he was talking to could recall the days when King Hazael was taking their land and terrorizing them. And now, because of that, God is promising retribution. The people of Damascus, their 4th sin, their straw that broke the camel's back, was involved threshing Gilead with instruments of iron. See, conquering the cities wasn't good enough. They had to destroy the villages. They had to slaughter the inhabitants. They massacred people. They committed wartime atrocities, killing civilians, women, children. And just as you would drag freshly harvested grain over iron prongs to separate the wheat from the chaff, these people did exactly that. Slaughtered so many people in absolute cold blood. Innocent people. This is an act of terrorism. In an act of terrorism, these terrorists would have to answer to God. Now, God promised to burn down the house of Hazael and eliminate their dynasties. And the people of Damascus actually felt very safe. They felt as if a big bar was protecting them from the surrounding nations. And God said he's going to break the bar of Damascus. And you know what their final judgment would be? is they would go into captivity into Kir. Now that's interesting because they actually got their independence from Kir. They actually, the people of Damascus, Syria, they came out of Kir and became their own nation. But God says one day they're going to end up right back where they started. Back into captivity, right where they started in Kir. You know, our world today tends to turn a blind eye to similar terrorism. There are acts of terrorism going from Islamic nations going against Christians, going around our world today that is very not reported on by the media. I've got friends and I've got missionary friends in Africa and this terrorism, it hits very close to home. And he's had family members of his church that have experienced this type of terrorism, and people are getting slaughtered and nobody's saying a word about it. But I want to tell you that one day God will defend the defenseless, and the bloodthirsty will meet an enemy that they cannot overcome. Amos chapter 1 verse 6 through 8. The Lord, thus saith the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Gaza and for 4, I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because they carried away captive the whole captivity, to deliver them up to Edom. But I will send a fire on the wall of Gaza, which shall devour the palaces thereof. And I will cut off the inhabitant from Ashdod, him that holdeth the scepter of Ashkelon. I will turn mine hand against Ekron, and the remnant of the Philistines shall perish, saith the Lord God. Now we've all heard that word Gaza. We know where that is. That's Palestine. Back in the day, that was known as the nation of Philistia. This was the Philistine Empire, and the chief port city was Gaza. But you see, the thing is not only did he preach against Gaza, but he also preached against Ashdod and Ashkelon and Ekron. So when he's adding all these cities to the list, he's actually condemning the entire nation. You know what their fourth sin is? Their fourth sin is they captured a town, brought them into captivity, and sold them into slavery to the Edomites. Very few human atrocities approach the horrors of the slave industry. Heard a preacher one time that went to Ghana, West Africa, and he visited the Cape Coast castle home of the slave traders. And this is where men and women were sold into slavery, and they were sold into slavery, sometimes sold into slavery by their own village warriors and their own brothers, sold into slavery into the Caribbean. It's hard to think of the type of people that would do this, and the European lords that made merchandise of humanity, and the seamen that sailed the ships that cared nothing for life. You know what the hypocrisy of our modern world is? The hypocrisy of our modern world is we rightly condemn these acts of the past. But then today, innocent girls are sold into Islamic slavery for prostitution rings. And we don't say anything about it. We don't do anything about it. I've got a friend, his name is Todd Allen. His whole family sings. And I'm hoping very soon, at some point next year, to have the Allen family come up and sing and preach for us. And man, Todd has got a tremendous testimony. Because Todd goes over there and he opens up orphanages. Because if you don't, these children will be sold into prostitution. And this is the kind of stuff he fights against in his ministry, and I'm looking forward to hearing him speak here one day next year. He's got a tremendous testimony. But people today might not notice, but you know who does notice? God notices. Whether it be in Philistia 2,700 years ago or at the godless pagans today, he makes a promise. In verse 7 and 8, he says, I will send a fire, I will cut off, I will turn mine hand against. And when the dust settles, all of them are going to perish. But did you know, as impossible as it may seem, the cities of Tyre actually outdid the cities of Gaza? Let's look at verse 9 and 10. Thus saith the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Tyrus, and for 4, I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because they delivered up the whole captivity to Edom, and remembered not the brotherly covenant. But I will send a fire on the wall of Tyrus, which shall devour the palaces thereof. The Bible says that they delivered up the whole captivity to Edom. So they would uproot not just one village, but entire villages and entire communities. They would uproot them and sell them into slavery to Edom. Now, this brotherly covenant that's talked about in verse 9, this was a long-standing promise between King Solomon and King Hiram that was broken, leading to God saying that he would send a fire on the wall of Tyrus. You know, back in the ancient day, a city's strength, their political power, was seen in the strength of their walls. The stronger and taller their walls were, and the stronger and taller their palaces were, that was a representation of their political power and their strength. And God said, your palace and your walls will melt before the wrath of an almighty God. Next, he calls Edom to stand forth. Verse 11 and 12. Thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Edom, and for 4, I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because he did pursue his brother with the sword, and did cast off all pity, and his anger did tear perpetually, and he kept his wrath forever. But I will send a fire upon Teman, which shall devour the palaces of Bozrah. Edom has a history with Israel that goes all the way back to the womb of Rebekah. And that's where their father Esau wrestled with Jacob. They never settled this family squabble. Verse 11 says, he did pursue his brother with the sword, cast off all pity, and his anger did tear perpetually, and he kept his wrath forever. This feud lasted for 1,100 years. Worsening each year. He kept his wrath forever. In fact, did you know Obadiah actually preached against Edomite pride that laughed at their brothers while they were being taken into slavery? Obadiah 1 verse 3 and 4. This is to the nation of Edom. The pride of thine heart hath deceived thee, thou that dwellest in the clefts of the rock, whose habitation is high, saith in his heart, who shall bring me down to the ground? Though thou exalt thyself as the eagle, and though thou set thy nest among the stars, thence I will bring thee down, saith the Lord. And God promised to burn down their southern city of Teman and devour their northern city of Bozrah. You see, the Israelites and the Edomites, I think they teach us a good lesson today. And that is family battles will not quietly go away. They're not just going to quietly go away. And the bitterness and anger that separated Esau and Jacob became a format of hatred that lasted for centuries. And the Edomites and the Israelites became the Bible equivalent to the Hatfields and McCoys. Next, God calls out the children of Ammon. Verse 13 through 15. Thus saith the Lord, for 3 transgressions of the children of Ammon, and for 4, I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because they have ripped up women with child of Gilead, that they might enlarge their border. And I will kindle a fire in the wall of Rabbah, and it shall devour palaces thereof, with shouting in the day of battle, with a tempest in the day of a whirlwind, and their king shall go into captivity, he and his princes together, saith the Lord. Now their ancestor was conceived by an incestuous relationship of Lot and one of his daughters. And you know, there were times when the Ammonites would actually fight the Israelites on the battlefield. There were other times when the Israelites were tempted by the idols and false gods of the Ammonites. But man, when God describes their forced sin, it's absolutely horrifying. People say, you can't show me abortion in the Bible. Oh, really? I guarantee you that I can. They ripped up the women with child of Gilead. See, the Ammonites had an unquenchable desire for power. And that meant, well, murdering helpless babies while they were still in the wombs of their mothers. See, they were fighting against Gilead, and they didn't want any future soldiers to get in their way. But just as they attacked these babies, God said, I will send attackers against them. It will be a whirlwind of wrath that their precious cities will be conquered, and they're going to be let out to slavery. And this is such an indictment against the abortion industry today, is it not? And we've actually come a long way recently with this in our nation, but let me tell you that we still have a long way to go. We've still got a lot of ground to cover with this. And you think about the murderous doctors and nurses that abort little babies to enlarge their business and pad their pockets, and cowardly politicians that deny little babies the choice to have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then you've got evil judges that refuse to protect the most innocent of all. Yet all these people that systematically destroy unborn children will meet a God of wrath. And they will learn quickly that they will reap what they sow. Chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. Thus saith the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Moab, and for 4, I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because he burned the bones of the king of Edom into lime. But I will send a fire upon Moab, and it shall devour the place of Kerith. And Moab shall die with a tumult, with shouting, and with the sound of a trumpet. And I will cut off the judge from the midst thereof, and will slay all the princes thereof with him, saith the Lord. You know, we should know here that God is very specific when dealing with these sins. God does not judge indiscriminately. He actually judges righteously. He calls out Moab for burning the king's bones into lime. It wasn't enough for Moab just to defeat Edom in war. They had to disgrace them. You know, by burning the king's bones, they were committing an act of desecration towards the king. Now, just as they burnt the bones of their enemy, now God's going to send fire upon them. See, the punishment fits the crime. Can you see Amos up there preaching? You know, when he's preaching these words, and the words are just as plain, and I can imagine that the crowd that's listening to him preach this message, they were stunned and they were shocked, and their eyes were on him, and they were all ears. Certainly their preferred minister, doctor, professor, Amaziah, would never preach this kind of message. But then Amos turns his attention to their sister nation of Judah to the south. Chapter 2, verse 4 and 5. Thus saith the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Judah, and for 4, I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because they have despised the law of the Lord, and have not kept his commandments, and their lies caused them to err, after the which their fathers have walked. But I will send a fire upon Judah, and it shall devour the palaces of Jerusalem. You know what the greatest sin of God's people is? Rejecting the Word of God. That's what it is. It says they have despised the laws of the Lord and have not kept his commandments. They despised the Bible. They disobeyed the Bible. They created their own false religious system and created their own idols, and they called and God called it a lie, which caused them to live in error. And their greatest sin was rejecting God's laws and creating their own religion. God promised to burn down the city of Jerusalem. Now I want to go back, and I want to stop for a second. I want to think about the implications of that. Let's think about that. You know, when you're put on a list with somebody, you're associated with them. Let's go back over this list of 4 sins. First, we have wartime atrocities, threshing the enemy, terrorism, slave trading, ripping children out of the womb, degrading the dead, and now add one more thing to the list: the sin of rejecting the Bible. You know, there are not many humans today that would agree with God. There are not many humans today that would agree that rejecting the Bible belongs on a list with all these other things. not the ministers who refuse to preach the Bible, not the seminary professors who attack the credibility of the Bible, not the judges who remove the Bible from our society, not the Hollywood elites that taught the Bible, not the average citizen who doesn't even consider the Bible, doesn't even read the Bible. Some 8 centuries would go by before the Son of God came to us and told us why this sin is so serious. And he explained it like this in John 12:48. He that rejecteth me and receiveth not my words hath one that judgeth him. The word that I have spoken, the same shall judge him in the last day. The preacher who refuses to preach the Bible will be condemned to hell by the Bible. The Bible scholar who destroys the faith of an eager young student will be destroyed by the very word he denies. The judge who exalts human wisdom over godly wisdom will be silenced by the book. The entertainment industry will learn too late that God is not mocked. And the sinner who never cared enough to open up the Bible will stand before God one day and will be without excuse. The lion has roared. The king has something to say. The nation of Israel is they have got a choice to make. They're either going to choose the pandering priest or they're going to choose the man of God. And their choice is going to determine their future. Now, very quickly, in chapter 2, it's Israel's turn. Now, years ago, there was a preacher. He got up, was preaching a revival service, and he began preaching. And man, he was preaching good, and he was laying it out, and people were hooping and hollering, and people were amening. And this is one of them old-timey Baptist churches, and they was hooping and hollering and amening. And man, there was this lady on the front pew, and man, she was amening along with the preacher and amening with everything he said. And then when he was preaching all these different sins, and then he started preaching on gossip. And right about that time, everybody got quiet. And just as everybody got quiet, the lady said to somebody next to her, he's gone to meddling now. And everybody heard it. Well, now Amaziah is fixing to start meddling. See, he's preached to all the nations that surround Israel. And now for the rest of the book, he turns his attention on Israel. Just like all these surrounding nations, they have reached their fourth sin. Amos 2, verse 6 through 8. Thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Israel and for 4, I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because they sold the righteous for silver and the poor for a pair of shoes. They pant after the dust of the earth and on the head of the poor, and turn aside the way of the meek. And a man and his father will go in unto the same maid to profane my holy name. And they lay themselves down upon clothes laid to pledge by every altar. And they drink the wine of the condemned in the house of God. Can you imagine how offended Israel is like this? Man, he's just got done condemning all these pagan nations with this phrase, for 3 transgressions and for 4, I will not turn away the punishment thereof. And now he stands here and looks at Israel and says the same thing to them. Now, the nation of Israel, I don't know if you know this, but the Jews have a superiority complex. And they see themselves as better than everybody else. But God is going to hold them to the same standard that He holds to everybody else. Why would God not demand righteousness from His own people? You know what the greatest sin of Israel is? Their abuse of power. They abuse their power. And Amos gives illustration after illustration after illustration of how they would abuse their power. When a poor man got a loan, the creditor would demand outrageous interest. And if the payment wasn't made, that person would be sold into slavery. And listen to this. You could owe a price that was equal to a pair of shoes, and still be sold into slavery. Imagine that you owed a bill that was equal to going down to Walmart and buying a pair of shoes, and you couldn't pay that little bill. equal to a pair of shoes. And for that little money, you were sold into slavery. These people were absolutely ruthless. The Bible says that the meek was turned aside. The poor man had no recourse in the courtrooms of the day. He would plead for justice, and the judge would dismiss the case with a wave of his hand. And these people assigned by God to watch after the humble would just do nothing but take advantage of them. They exploited the poor. Their exploitation of the poor included sexual abuse too. Maids were abused by both the fathers and the sons, and then they would bring the excuse that they did it in the name of God, that they did it in the name of Yahweh, perversely. They were also violating the Word of God, because if a poor man is heavily fined, he could leave his coat behind for a collateral on the bill and then go find the money, but the religious phony would use this poor man's coat to stay warm. And you're supposed to give the coat back at night to keep him from freezing, but they did. You think they did that? Absolutely they didn't. Exodus 22:26, if thou at all take thy neighbor's raiment to pledge, thou shalt deliver it unto him by the sun goeth down. They wouldn't give the coats back. They'd keep them. They didn't care. They didn't care if they froze to death. They wanted their money that was equal to a pair of shoes. Let them freeze. Now, when those fines were paid, and the extorted money was taken, you know what it was used for? For parties in a house of religion, in the house of a pagan god. It's one thing when sin runs rampant in a land, and it's another thing when it runs rampant in a house of religion. The priests are supposed to be the holy standard of righteousness. They're supposed to demonstrate justice, but yet these religious leaders were the worst criminals of all. Amos 2:9-11. Yet I destroyed the Amorite before them, whose height was like the height of cedars, and he was strong as oaks. Yet I destroyed his fruit from above, his roots from beneath. Also I brought you up from the land of Egypt, and led you 40 years through the wilderness to possess the land of the Amorite. And I raised up your sons for prophets, and of your young men for Nazarites. Is it not even thus, O ye children of Israel, saith the Lord? Well, God reminded them, hey, you know what I did for you? I destroyed the Amorites and gave you their land. I brought you out of the land of Egypt. I watched out for you for 40 years in the wilderness. I brought your sons up and I made them Nazarites and I made them priests. And they weren't moved by any of it. Verse 12, but she gave the Nazarites wine to drink and commanded the prophets to prophesy not. They turned the prophets into drunks and commanded them to prophesy not. Things are getting hot. You can almost feel the body of Amos shaking in holy anger as you hear the passionate words flow from his heart. A case is being built against Israel, and God's wrath is being aroused. Verse 13, behold, I am pressed under you as a cart is pressed that is full of sheaves, like an overloaded cart that's crunching the axles underneath it. The wrath, the rebellion of Israel has brought the wrath of a mighty God that to the place where something must be done. Verse 14, therefore the flight shall perish from the swift. The strong shall not strengthen his force. Neither shall the mighty deliver himself, neither shall he stand that handleth the bow. He that is swift of foot shall not deliver himself, neither shall he that rideth the horse deliver himself. What's he saying here? The fastest runner will not outrun the judgment of God. The strongest weightlifter will not have the power to set himself free. The greatest archer will not hit the target. The champion jockey, he will not ride his horse faster than the wrath of heaven. The most courageous soldier will not even take the time to get dressed while he's running for his life. Perhaps in churches today we don't have enough Amoses that are willing to do some meddling. It's easy for Amos to condemn the surrounding nations. But when Amos takes the pulpit, turns it 180 degrees, and starts preaching to the choir, you can bet he's going to get a reaction. But you can't miss his point. God is preparing to deal with Israel for their own righteousness. The judgment clock is about to strike midnight, and it's the job of the man of God to detail the reasons why. And when the anger of God is kindled, we don't need positive preaching or promise preaching or polite preaching. We need a man of God to stand up and do some meddling. Like I said, this is a story of a preacher. Israel had the options laid out before him. You had the hand picked by the king, Dr. Professor Amaziah, PhD, who is all he's worried about is the king's chapel and the king's court. And then you got a sheep herder over here. And he ain't the preacher and he ain't the preacher's son, but he'll do the preaching till the preaching's done. And what he's worried about is the sins of the people destroying the land. Israel is offended. Israel is indignant. Amos decided to do some meddling. And every once in a while we need somebody to do some meddling in our lives. You want to know why we need people? We need men and we need teachers and we need the Bible to do some meddling in our lives. Because the last thing, I would rather these teachers and Bible preachers do the meddling in my life than God. You don't want God to meddle in your life. You really don't. You know what we need to do if we're in sin today? Repent. We got to repent. Let's pray. Dear gracious Heavenly Father, Lord, thank you for the Word of God. Lord, we're here today, tonight, we're studying this book and we're studying this, the sheep herder, God. Lord, you had a purpose for him to go north and preach to the nation of Israel, Lord, to preach against their sin. And Lord, as we go through this book, Lord, help us to apply what we learn from Amos to our lives, Lord, and help us to look inward in some things that maybe we've been overlooking, Lord. Maybe we've got some sin in our lives that we've been overlooking for too long, but Lord, eventually, Lord, you always deal with sin. Lord, we plead ourselves on your grace. Help us to repent. Turn back to you, Lord. Confess our sin. Thank you for all you've done for us. Bless us as we go out tonight. In Jesus Christ's precious name I pray. Amen.